Like I said, hello and welcome. I'm Kate Clarke Lemay, and I use pronouns she, her. I'm the acting senior historian at the National Portrait Gallery and the interim director of Portal, the Portrait Gallery's scholarly center. Thank you so much for joining us today for our lecture, which features the latest research by Dr. Rick Herrera, who is professor of military history at the School of Advanced Military Studies, the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Dr. Herrera will present First in War, First in Peace, First in the Arts of His Countrymen, Charles Willson Peale, George Washington, and the visual creation of American identity. We are really excited to hear from Dr. Herrera today. For today's Q&A, because my specialty is in American art and its intersections with military history, I'm going to be moderating, so that's exciting. Before we begin, we'd like to give a land acknowledgement. Although we are tuning in together today from different places, as you can see in the chat, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. We also recognize the inherent flaws of portraiture. Since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws as well as its strengths. The National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. We are so pleased to present today's event as part of the Greenberg-Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. We extend our gratitude to Susan Steinhauser and her late husband, Dan Greenberg, who are the sponsors for tonight's program, for their generosity, which makes this ongoing virtual conversation series possible. Okay, so like I said, a little bit of ground guidelines for the Zoom format. Please use the chat function. Let us know where you're watching. Please make comments, connections of your own ideas as you listen. That is your place to share. When the Q&A starts, that's when you're going to use the Q&A feature to submit questions to be answered during the Q&A after the presentation. So there's two different functions. The Q&A is where you're going to submit your questions for Dr. Herrera. I'm now going to introduce today's guest. Dr. Rick Herrera is professor of military history at the School of Advanced Military Studies, U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. A graduate of Marquette University and UCLA, Dr. Herrera is the author of For Liberty and the Republic, The American Citizen, a Soldier, 1775 to 1861, and of several articles, and chapters on military history. His next book, Feeding Washington's Army, Surviving the Valley Forge Winter of 1778, will be published by the University of North Carolina Press in March of 2022. He is currently editing a journal and a collection of letters tentatively titled A Most Uncommon Soldier, the Letters and Journal of Edward Ashley Bowen Phelps, 1846 to 1848, which will be published by the University Press of Kansas. Okay, so without further ado, let's turn to the lecture itself and welcome Dr. Herrera.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thanks to everyone who's here. This is really, this is something I'm looking forward to. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Rising in Philadelphia's German Lutheran Church to eulogize George Washington on 26 December 1799, Representative Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, let's see here, we should be on the first slide, please. There we go, perfect. The third, delivered a florid oration commemorating his old friend and former commander-in-chief. Near the end of his 3,500-word peroration, Lee declaimed Washington as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Some of the most memorable words in American funeral oratory. In Lee's words, Washington was second to none. The public outpourings of grief, the mock funeral held in Philadelphia, the gun salutes, the official mourning period, all of which lasted through Washington's birthday on 22 February, speaks to the great man's life and attests to his place in the public's heart and toward the construction of identity and shared memory in the early republic. In this process, few media were as powerful as the visual arts. Viewing a portrait is much like reading a biography. They are three-way conversations between the viewer, the reader, the portraitist, the biographer, and the subject. Each engages the other simultaneously through viewing, reading, portraying, writing, and reflecting. There is, however, an important distinction in portraiture. Rarely do scholarly citations or primary evidence accompany the portrait. Indeed, fortunate is a historian for whom the artist has left written evidence detailing choices made in the work. Hence, the conversation between viewer, artist, and subject is far more personal, intimate, and subject to individual interpretation than ever will be in a biography. Portraiture, therefore, is at once public and personal. Art, particularly portraiture, was an elemental piece in the creation of the public Washington. Consequently, he was also first in the arts of his countrymen, and this was a legacy well established before his lifetime, rather during his lifetime. Guided by their patrons' tastes, what they believed the public wanted, what they hoped to sell, and by their own sensibilities, American artists made Washington's image an emblem of the new republic. In declaring their independence and waging an imperial civil war, American rebels overthrew not just British rule, but also their monarch and his personification of who they were as British subjects. This did not mean, however, that Americans had foregone that elemental human trait of identifying a leading individual with a greater cause and thus with themselves. Washington, therefore, became the canvas upon which artists and Americans projected and celebrated the country's promise, its hopes, and its virtues. Nowhere were these more prominently displayed than in portraits of Washington the soldier. The portrayals of the great man number in the thousands. Craftsmen reproduced his image on milk jugs, clocks, and every sort of item for everyday use. The National Portrait Gallery alone holds over 100 images, ranging from prints to sculptures to paintings. The gallery's catalog of American portraits contains many more listings held in other collections, executed by scores of artists and craftsmen endowed with varying degrees of talent, taste, and imagination. Entering a Google search for portraits of George Washington reveals about 15,500,000 results in 0.86 seconds. So you've got quite a bit. And when going through these, one is forced to sort through the digital and artistic wheat, separating it from the chaff. Hence, any consideration of Washington as a military man must be selective. Now, I have to confess, I'm not an art historian, although my dear friend Kate Lemay is doing her best to make me one. Kate is the Borg and cannot be resisted. I shall be assimilated. I'm a historian of early America, and more particularly, a military historian whose work has examined American military history in its cultural and intellectual respects, as well as more traditional operational approaches. Thus, I propose an approach incorporating my own expertise, as well as my own tentative toe into the waters of art history. Upon and through Washington's likenesses, these artists impressed their visions and interpretations of the age. Washington became the medium for their allegorical messages. Washington sat for 18 artists, generally at others' behests, who created his image. Among them, however, only 3 artists, Charles Willson Peale, John Trumbull, and William Rush, were his fellow soldiers in the American War for Independence. They were artists who had donned the uniform and who had experienced and grasped the essence of warfare and military life, but who were not always bound by strict accuracy in their compositions. Hence, for them, interpretation and message mattered far more than did a precise ordering or rendering of events, objects, and individuals. Yet, in their compositions were their truths about Washington, their fellow citizens, and the history and identity of the newborn United States. Through these, Washington, the Republican soldier, embodies their idealized versions of America. However, when limited to Peale, Trumbull, and Rush, the number of works, the richness of detail, and the message preclude anything but the most passing of deliberations. Thus, a just and serious consideration must limit the scope and inquiry to a single artist. Honors in this case go to Charles Willson Peale, the first to have portrayed Washington in uniform. Washington sat for Peale 7 times, the most for any artist. Washington turned out scores of his portraits on canvas, in miniatures, and in mezzotints. Other artists, in turn, copied and reproduced Peale's images of Washington. Peale alone painted and replicated his own works of Washington some 700 times. Beginning with his earliest compositions, Peale channeled his Whiggish politics and those of his patrons through his brush. Hence, his portraits of Washington were allegories, which leaves them very much open to individual interpretation, with viewers imposing their own truths and understandings on the portrayals. Furthermore, the lack of firm primary evidence explaining the compositions, attire, and more leaves Peale's works subject to even greater individual readings. Thus, while not all truths in art are self-evident, they are all subject to the beholder, and to judge solely by accuracy is to play the pedant. Peale familiarized the world with Washington and visually connected the man, the cause, and the republic as one and the same. His commissions, celebrating Washington's earliest victories, heralded American resilience and the ability to rise, strike back, and triumph in the darkest days of the war. His portraits were a visual biography of the first soldier of the Republic. Washington's wartime sittings with Peale were therefore the artist's most important in the early visual creation of American identity through artistry. Peale presented Washington the soldier as the personification of the American struggle for independence, a Republican in service to his fellow citizens, a Republican general leading his fellow citizen soldiers. When Peale began his first depiction of Washington, he encountered a man deeply interested in local and imperial politics and economic matters. Like most men of his station, Washington was a planter and slaveholder. He was therefore enmeshed in colonial and imperial politics and trade. Parliament's seeming arbitrary legislation had strained Washington's affections for empire. Parliament's steady intrusion into colonial governance signaled to Washington the eroding of the British Constitution and the traditional rights and liberties of Englishmen, including local governance. Within a few days, Washington wrote to the Reverend John Boucher that his inclination having yielded to importunity, I am now, contrary to all expectation, under the hands of Mr. Peale. Almost sounds like a surgeon, but in so grave and so sullen a mood, and now and then under the influence of Morpheus, that when some critical strokes are making, that I fancy the skill of this gentleman's pencil will be put to it in describing to the world what manner of man I am. Sullenness, meaning without energy, and drowsiness aside, Washington had no doubt of Mr. Peale's meeting with very good encouragement. Within a short time, Peale had won over Washington with his talent and personality. Indeed, over the next several days, Peale executed miniatures of wife Martha, stepson Jackie, and stepdaughter Martha, Patsy, Park Custis for Washington. Over the next several years, their familiarity grew. Of the military life sittings, the first dated to 1772, while the next 4 were of Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1776, 77, 79, and 1783 and 84. In Peale's 1772 portrait of Colonel Washington, formerly commander of the Virginia Regiment in the 7 Years' War, we see a self-assured officer looking southeastward into the distance. The audience has come upon a soldier in a moment of calm, quiet, untroubled introspection. His face is still youthful. He's no longer the callow, carping young man he had once been. In the background, a ridgeline suggests the Blue Ridge Mountains, the western boundary of the Shenandoah Valley, where Washington had spent so much of his time during the war. During a service there, Washington had served as a burgess for Frederick County, where he also owned land and held ample claims beyond the distant ridge lines in the Ohio country. Hence, geography places Washington in 3 spatial and chronological contexts. He's grounded in Virginia, his gaze directed southeastward toward his home at Mount Vernon, with the promise of Indian lands won by him and fellow provincials in the Great War for Empire, beckoning the gaze of viewers with eyes toward the future. It is a political message affirming colonial claims and challenging imperial authority. American colonists believed that these lands, claimed by Virginia, were their due for having fought and sacrificed in the war against France and its native allies. The Proclamation of 1763, however, denied that promise by forbidding colonial settlement beyond the mountains. No matter. Washington's right elbow is subtly directing and nudging open the near ridgeline for white western expansion. Through the gap over which Washington suspends his elbow is a passage for those settlers. A stream, waterfall, and pond set amidst a verdant landscape promotes the land's fertility. To the left, you'll see two wigwams, albeit without any occupants. Peale might be alluding to Washington's service against the Delawares and Shawnees in the war, but their wigwams were rounded, not conical. Thus, the fuller message is ambiguous. The wigwams can be interpreted as symbols of a pastoral agrarian fantasy, an affirmation of America as the New World, or, as is more likely, to reinforce the message that Washington was a soldier who had served in the greatest conflict to have taken place in North America, and that colonizing the western frontier, better known as Indian country, was the future. Washington, as the great historian Colin G. Calloway notes, looked upon Indian country as colonial space temporarily inhabited by Indian people. As much as one might desire a hopeful vision that speaks to the diversity and distinctiveness of America, it is instead a triumphant and grim reminder of Washington the Conqueror, Conaticarius, the town destroyer. Washington's uniform mixes both casual and formal features, and it deviates slightly from the initial orders specifying its composition. His cocked hat is unlaced and plain, its edge unbound. It was supposed to have originally had a silver lace on it. Its sole decoration is an indistinctly embossed silver button that suggests a spread eagle with its head turned to the right. A bit of silver lace extends upward from the button, affixing a black silk cockade. Tied around Washington's neck is a crisp white stock. A silver gorget, that silver piece hanging about his neck, embossed with the arms of Great Britain, strung by a blue ribbon, hangs below his throat and announces Washington as an officer. His regimental coat is of the period, a short standing collar. It's open, revealing a casually buttoned scarlet waistcoat laced in silver. There are 5 undone buttons, 4 for his gloved right hand, another 2 below the sash. His right hand inside the waistcoat was an important element in the overall bearing, which drew upon classical accounts and the statuary of ancient orators. As Francois Nivelon, a leading early modern arbiter of manners, had asserted in his 1737 Rudiments of Genteel Behavior, the pose manifested a manly boldness, tempered with a becoming modesty, and thereby distinguished the polite gentleman from the rude rustic. Years later, as an adolescent, Washington had noted in his copybook that the gestures of the body must be suited to the discourse you are upon. Consequently, by placing Washington's right hand in the waistcoat, Peale has fixed Washington within an august constellation. In his left pocket, Washington has thrust folded orders entitled Order of March. It suggests a recent council of war with officers of his regiment, or perhaps with Britain's General John Forbes, under whom Washington had served in the 1758 campaign against Fort Duquesne, today's Pittsburgh. Rather than the blue breeches stipulated in 1755, Washington's are scarlet, an indication of the latitude afforded and taken by some officers. Thrusting upward from under Washington's left arm and awkwardly held behind the back of his left hand, is a fusil, a finely made officer's long arm. As an officer's privately purchased firearm, the fusil conformed to the owner's taste. It does not, however, appear to have a shoulder strap indicative of a military weapon, although a sling swivel faintly shows beneath a ramrod pipe. Over Washington's shoulder is another badge of rank, a faded sash, suggesting that he is no mere desk officer. He's a seasoned campaigner and a man of action. Now, rather than buttoning his lapels in a turn-back fashion to show his regiment's facings, Washington has left them unfastened, revealing the silver lace and the plain buttons. He's fastidious, but not fussy. He had taken to the admonition to play not the peacock to heart. He was but 40 years old. Washington had last donned this uniform 13 years earlier, when he was a colonel. Nevertheless, he retained his military bearing despite a developing waistline. A planter he was, but in Washington's heart and mind, he remained a soldier. Behind his left hip is a jewel-like small sword, more suited to formal wear than usage on campaign. London cutler Matthew Vesey had assembled the silver-hilted 1767 small sword from pre-manufactured parts, including a blade made in Solingen in Germany. Peale thus portrays Washington as a man of action, yet also a man of refinement and one of substance. By situating him against the background suggestive of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the viewer is meant to see a land led by men who embody the best of the old and the new worlds. Paired with Washington's youthful face, Peale's composition relates the man to the land. They were youthful, vigorous, and full of promise. Even within the midst of nature, refinement coexisted with power and strength. Washington is a personification of America and its promise. Peale next sat for Washington in May 1776, this time at the importuning of John Hancock, president of the Second Continental Congress. This is when they met together in Philadelphia. Washington had been commander-in-chief for less than a year, but he had one acclaim for forcing the British to abandon Boston. You can see here, and I'm going to skip a little bit because I tend to have gotten a little bit verbose. Peale is presenting the general here with Boston Harbor and the town behind it. You can see Charlestown, that smudge in the distance beyond that. He's standing on Dorchester Heights wearing a uniform that conjures his immediate past and his identity as a Virginian, but also the nature of his new command. Washington's buff-faced blue regimental coat and blue small clothes are the colors of the Fairfax Independent Company, in which the gentlemen wore blue and buff uniforms. His uniform therefore pronounces the nature of the Continental Army and its commander. It is an army of citizen soldiers led by a fellow citizen. As for his emblems of office, instead of a gorget, a light blue silk moire ribbon and undecorated gold epaulets mark Washington as the commander-in-chief. Officers and non-commissioned officers required devices to distinguish them. Whereas Washington's scarlet waistcoat in the previous portrait bore silver lace, his buff waistcoat is richly embroidered in gold thread, another affirmation of the general's status. Similar to his previous sitting, Washington's hand is thrust inside his waistcoat. This time it is the left hand. In doing so, Peale has freed Washington's right hand, which rests against his hip in an aristocratic pose as it grasps the head of a walking stick, an emblem of authority. The stick parallels Washington's sword, the pommel of which is directed toward Boston, while the walking stick angles toward his jawline. Both are visual guides and representations of status that draw the viewer's eyes upward and toward the feature's most important elements, the general's face and the scenes of his and Americans' earliest victories. Now, as if to suggest victory rising from the ashes of defeat, Washington's sword evokes the one he reputedly wore in the attack against the French party at Jumonville-Glen on 23 May 1754, and at his surrender and humiliation at Fort Necessity on the 4th of July 1754. Despite the resemblance, it is not his 1753 small sword. This small sword here has actually lost its tape and wire grips, and the pommels, button, and guards differ markedly. The fluting motif differs. It is, however, nice to think that it just may conjure up that image. Now, beyond the rough triangle of the Shawmut Peninsula and the Charles River, crowded with sails of the Royal Navy, a dark blue plume of smokes rises from Charlestown. This is to remind readers of its destruction on 17 June 1775, but also of the Pyrrhic British victory at Bunker Hill. The plume blends into the glowering sky. Beacon Hill is beneath the dark smudge of Charlestown. To the town's left are the Mill Pond and Dam and Miller Hill. Directly behind Washington and to either side of the sword hilt are 2 cannon and 2 soldiers. The guns overlook Boston Harbor. They also threaten the garrison and the Navy. On the left, a soldier with his back to the viewer stands guard in a blue regimental coat and pipe-clayed white shoulder belts with his musket at shoulder, while to his right, a brown-coated soldier moves sandbags in a wheelbarrow. You can get an idea here from these close-ups. Peale's message takes precedence over historical or chronological accuracy. His portrait conflates two significant events bookending the siege of Boston. First was the Battle of Bunker Hill on 17 June 1775, which sealed the fate of the British Army in Boston. Despite having won the battle, the British had not crushed the New Englanders. As New England and the mid-Atlantic militias poured in, seized and fortified the commanding ground, and tightened the noose around Boston, British options narrowed. Earlier in May, a British force led jointly by Ethan Allen of Vermont and Colonel Benedict Arnold of Connecticut had captured Fort Ticonderoga, its artillery and stores. By January, the noble train of artillery was at Framingham, just outside Boston. With the siege train at hand, Washington ordered the artillery to be placed on Dorchester Heights in order to threaten the British positions. By 4 March, following a diversionary bombardment, the guns occupied the hill and fortifications were constructed. Peale has captured two of the signal moments thus far, and he's established a visual chronology. With the more distant triumph in the background and Washington standing in the midst of his own more recent victory, a mere 7 months after the Battle of Bunker Hill, it was no matter that Washington was not present at Bunker Hill. Victories demanded celebration, and capitalizing on this work, Peale struck off over 100 mezzotints of it for popular consumption. Boston notwithstanding, battlefield victories were increasingly rare for the Continental Army. Washington was bested in New York by General Howe. He lost battles nearly every time he faced the British. The British then chased him across New Jersey into Pennsylvania. Howe ordered his army into winter quarters. Along the Delaware and throughout New Jersey, he dispersed his forces to maintain control. With enlistments of the Continental Army on the verge of expiration and hope for the success ebbing, Washington struck back. On the night of 25 December, the army crossed the Delaware River and launched a surprise attack on the Hessian Brigade at Trenton the next morning. After killing, wounding, and capturing some 900 enemy soldiers and seizing their arms and equipment and colors, the army returned once more to Pennsylvania, but not for long. It fought once again on the 29th of December. It crossed once more on that date, returned to Trenton, and then fought once more. Lord Cornwallis, who brought a division of 8,000 soldiers to try and capture Washington, was reputed to have said, "We've got the old fox now." In the meantime, Washington convened a council of war. He decided to strike back. He had his soldiers for but a short time. It was better to act. On the 2nd of January, his army repulsed Cornwallis's attacks. Having held his ground, Washington secretly decamped in the evening of 2 January 1777 and early on the morning of the 3rd. Cornwallis was, of course, surprised. Washington was marching his army northward to Princeton. He was on the attack yet again. This time he attacked Cornwallis's 4th Brigade under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood. The enemy brigade mustered around 1,500 soldiers. During the fighting, Washington's close friend, Brigadier General Hugh Mercer, was mortally wounded. By the end of the day, Washington had driven from Princeton the British enemy. Over the course of 10 days, he had won 3 victories. Although these battles were small in scale, they were tremendous in consequence. The counteroffensives had exposed the folly of scattering small detachments throughout the countryside. Peale took part in these counterstrokes as an officer of the Philadelphia Associators, the city's militia. He had first entered as a common soldier on 9 August 1776. The following year, he received a commission as captain and commanded the 4th Company of the 2nd Battalion under Colonel John Bayard. He'd marched across the Delaware on the 25th of December, but rain, hail, and heavy river ice prevented his crossing until the 27th. As a part of this, Peale fought at 2nd Trenton and then at Princeton, and then marched to Morristown on 6 January. While there, Peale had the chance to paint a miniature of a Captain Boyd on Wednesday the 15th. 4 days later, Peale's battalion set out for home, and after that, they returned home on Sunday the next. Peale returned home, but only for a few months. On 26 September 1777, the British Army marched into Philadelphia. It had just landed at Head of Elk in August, won signal victories at Brandywine and Paoli. The next time the British would meet up with the Americans would be in June of 1778 at the Battle of Monmouth. While the campaigning season had ended, the army returned to Morristown for the winter. On the 18th of December, Congress directed Washington to attend it as soon as convenient. While in Philadelphia, the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, deeply sensible how much the liberty, safety, and happiness of America in general, and Pennsylvania in particular, is owing to His Excellency General Washington and the brave men under his command, do resolve that His Excellency General Washington be requested to permit the council to place his portrait in the council chamber. Washington already had a distaste for sitting for portraits, and it continued to get stronger, but he was unable to dismiss the honor. Pleading modesty, Washington's respect for the body led him to acquiesce. Once more, he sat for Charles Willson Peale. What Howe could not do in New York, nor Cornwallis at Trenton, Pennsylvania's council did when it requested that the general sit for a portrait. He had been cornered. Washington spent much of December and all of January in Philadelphia attending Congress. Now, sometime between the 20th of January and 1st of February, Washington sat for Peale. 3 weeks following the departure from Philadelphia, Peale set out to take a journey and take perspectives of Trenton and Princeton. His 1779 portrait of General Washington of Princeton was the basis for 20 copies he made for admiring patrons and institutions, but also for numerous mezzotints that were more affordable. He seems to have sold the mezzotints anywhere from $2 to $5 per framed copy. Peale had charged $5 per Washington print in 1778, so it stands to reason he had found a way to reduce his production overhead and protect himself against inflation. In the original portrait, which we're looking at, Washington confidently stands amid some of the customary trophies of war. His right hand rests on his hip with hat upturned, conveying to readers that Washington is a man of quality, but also signaling through his doffed hat his respect for the viewers. His left hand rests on the muzzle of what appears to be a light 12-pounder cannon, with a muzzle of a second 12-pounder visible to the rear. The guns, however, are not captured Hessian pieces. Colonel Johann's Raw Brigade surrendered 6 3-pounders. Rather than signaling the twin victories of Trenton and Princeton, as Charles Coleman Seller contends, the guns signify the Army's readiness to fight. By placing Washington's hand on the muzzle, Peale brings together the man, the institution, and the cause. Washington is at the heart of the struggle for independence. Behind him to his left, an orderly holds his horse, while ranks of fixed bayonets rise behind the mount and guard a dark blue flag with 13 stars. This is a signal that the army is ready to stand and fight. It's ready to strike back. Beside Washington and below his feet, 2 or 3 captured Hessian colors rest against the cannon's left wheel. You also see a British color lying behind him. These captured flags are significant elements in the composition. Each Hessian regiment carried 1 flag for company, the Leibfahne, the life flag of the first company, and the 4 Kompanie-Fahnen, or company flags, for the others. At Trenton, the greater part of 3 regiments, Losberg, Kniphausen, and Rahl, surrendered 15 flags. Details such as the Hessian coronet and the lion standing clutching a sword suggest that Peale modeled the flags after some of the captured colors. There's a bit of artistic license. This is to be given. The lion is solid red rather than the horizontally striped red and white. The green and black fields of the colors suggest that these are the Kompanie-Fahnen from the regiments von Rahl, green, and Kniphausen, black. As for the British color, however, it's the 1707 red ensign, which served as a naval, merchant marine, and national flag, but also as the colony's flag. Unlike their Hessian counterparts, British regiments of foot carried 2 colors, the King's color, which you can see, and also the Union, the regimental color. You can see here the 17th Regiment of Foot, which was Mahood's home regiment, rather. Now, if we go ahead and go to the next slide here. You'll also notice that Washington is carrying a new sword. This is his Cutto, made in Fishkill, New York. Now, Peale had altered several elements in these portraits. You'll see here, the sword remains the same. He has just new actions going on in the background. Two officers or cavalrymen, it's difficult to tell, riding calmly, discussing things off to Washington's right. Now, if you look here, Peale has painted out the blue sash that Washington had previously worn. You can still see the faint shadow in it. Now, in this, Washington again still maintains the pose of the victor. When Peale painted Washington at Trenton, he altered the backdrop, and that would be the next slide, please. And you'll see that there you go, the Delaware River and the town appear. It's very much the same composition with the background altered. As in the previous versions, there are two cannon, hence they do not symbolize those victories at Trenton and Princeton. Peale rendered one last portrait of Washington at the Battle of Trenton. This was to be his fifth rendering of the Virginian, and the last while Washington still held his commission. On the 18th of April, 1783, orders to the army announced the cessation of hostilities between the United States of America and the King of Great Britain. Diplomats had affirmed the preliminary agreement on 30 November 1782 and had signed the Treaty of Paris on 3 September 1783. Congress ratified it on the 14th of January 1784. Now came the difficult task of creating the United States, and in this, Peale and Washington, through the urging of the trustees of the College of New Jersey, today's Princeton University, joined forces to the power of portraiture. The trustees appointed a committee to request that Washington sit for a picture that would be taken by Peale, where it would hang in Nassau Hall. Let's go to the next slide, please. That's good enough. We'll hang it here. We'll hold it here. This is the previous portrait that had occupied that location. Now, according to legend, this portrait of George II was decapitated by an American cannonball. Now, making it even better, Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery was the one that took out the king. Who better than little Alexander Hamilton to destroy the British monarch? After this, artists took the same frame, they removed the crown, and Peale decided to fit his portrait into the same portrait or into the same frame that had previously held the king. So let's go ahead with the next one, please. Perfect. Now, in the previous portraits of Washington, Peale had focused on the victory attained. Here, however, Washington is in the midst of combat. His sword is raised as though he's a conductor. In this, Washington is omnipresent. Peale reinforces his argument of Washington as a great director of events. As in the previous portraits of Washington maintains his aristocratic pose, left hand on the hip, removed his hat out of respect. He carries his weight on the right leg, while the left foot, axis toward the heel, extends about a foot of way. This mannerism, according to art historian Mikhail Buffard, was an element of the long fourth open position, one of the 5 formal stances of early modern dance adopted by European portraitists. What this meant was to convey the subject's distinction, his civility, his grace, sociability, and gentility. In this case, the bearing speaks to Washington's authority and self-confidence. Known as an accomplished and enthusiastic dancer, several elements of Washington's persona merge into one image. In personifying the new republic, Washington the soldier is also a man of refinement, republican virtue, and respect. He thus speaks to the promise of the American people. Battle notwithstanding, his gaze is untroubled. You can see here some of the elements of the battle, smoke arising and a light triangle forming to allow sunshine in to see Nassau Hall. You see a British rider coming from the distance bearing a flag of surrender. Stolid American lines pour volleys into a mass of confused British redcoats. You see cavalry to your left engaging against the British. Victory is at hand. Let's go ahead to the next slide, please. Here are the elements of the dance pose and of Washington's pose. Now, in what appears to be a nod to fashion, Washington is wearing top boots or hunt boots, distinguishable by the tan cuffs. Now, fashionable men, fox hunters and jockeys had adopted it. Peale, and this here is meant to be my own interpretation, Peale is suggesting that Washington, the old fox, has turned the tide. In one reporter's words, Washington purportedly exclaimed, "It's a fine fox chase, my boys." Now, we don't know that it was actually true, but it does speak to Washington's affinity for fox hunting, but also his having turned the tables against his enemy. Now, in Peale's portrait of this, we see that Washington has been elevated above all. All of the portraits are filled with artful details, yet they are subject to the interpretation of the viewer. Literalism misses and indeed obfuscates the point of Peale's patriotic didacticism. He mixes precise representations with fanciful and symbolic pieces. Peale surrounded Washington with an iconography rife with meaning, often direct in its meaning, but frequently subject to the viewer's interpretations. Washington's elevation to demigod was not far behind. Not all Americans approved of it. Benjamin Rush had acidly remarked, "Our Congress begin already to talk of the state necessity in Washington's advancement." He feared that tyranny can now enter our country only in the shape of a wig. Historian John Ferling notes that others, including John Adams, his cousin Samuel, thought the treatment of Washington as a demigod was plain wrong. These opinions, however, were the minority. Hence, in Peale's depictions, he had played a prominent role in elevating the man. In overturning British rule, Americans had attacked the image of George III. They'd overthrown their monarch in America. This did not, however, mean that they had done away with their need to personalize a collective effort and identity. Who better to supplant the royal George than the Republican George? Peale's depictions were instrumental in doing so. Naturally, the better read and more educated the viewer, the richer and the fuller the meanings in Peale's portrayals. Still, these portraits fulfilled their role as visual primers for teaching and conveying elements of national identity through the arts. Peale reached out to a broad audience, hungry for news, entertainment, visual and intellectual stimulation, as well as emotional identification. Peale the portraitist was Peale the pedagogue, who professed a new political order and identity. This was done for a new people. Who better than Washington to convey the centrality of the message regarding a rising people and a new political order? Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, Dr. Herrera, I'm impressed. You've joined the legions of art historians now, I think.
Thank you. I told you, you're the Borg. I cannot resist. My assimilation is complete.
The Borg actually can attack Earth or something like that. So we'll have to work on that analogy. But I'm thrilled, that to have this, to have you here as a guest of Portal and to hear such a thorough way of analyzing George Washington's military career. And one of the things that really struck me is, as you point out, Charles Willson Peale served in the Continental Army. And it's interesting to think about the witness of war painting the hero of war. And so I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit more about maybe what Peale himself experienced in the Second Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton? In his diary, according to my colleague, David Ward, Peale actually noted having seen war crimes and atrocities like rape and murder on behalf of the British against the colonials. And so I was just thinking about, how did he resolve those very difficult experiences and then create this, hagiographic portrayal of George Washington? What do you think?
That's great. Yeah, just a minor corrective, and I think it's an important distinction. Peale is actually in the Philadelphia Associators, which brigaded together as part of the larger Philadelphia militia, had served alongside the Continental Army. The reason that I find that important is that Philadelphia did not have a tradition of military service because of its Quaker heritage. And in fact, it's only about, if I remember correctly, 1747, that Benjamin Franklin, who was instrumental in forming the Associators, which becomes the basis for Philadelphia's militia into the War of Independence. So Peale joins the militia, and you can't get more citizen soldier than that. They are electing their officers in many cases, and the officers have got to defer to their soldiers. They've got to be nice because the next morning, he's going to be your shopkeeper or your butcher or your candlestick maker, and you don't want to be ripped off or treated poorly. But
no rancid meat, please.
And so what takes place is that when Washington, rather Peale, he's marching through along really rather primitive roads, mud, ice, and then when you do have a freeze rain cycle, you get this churned up mud that comes up that becomes spikes. Great stuff for twisting ankles, which is unfun when you're doing a road march. When Peale will cross the river, most of the heavy river ice has floated away. There's still chunks of it. They've got to be careful about that out of fear of capsizing the boats or perhaps even being rammed by a large piece.
Right.
Once they land, it's a repeat of the march. In the battle, he's Peale, along with the rest of the militia, as well as the Continentals, were placed behind Assunpink River, and therefore they've got the advantage, but also the great comfort. I can't stress that enough. The great comfort on their part at being behind a defensive work. This works wonders in steadying these amateur soldiers' nerves, and right. They've also got the presence of their officers walking the line, talking to them.
Right.
Peale, as a captain, probably would not have been doing much walking and talking. As a captain in a battalion of infantry, odds are he would have been standing in the line, giving commands to load, fire, among other things like that. He may have been encouraging the soldiers to his left and right who were within earshot, but after a few rounds of musketry, they may have gone deaf. But still, his presence is there. It's an important piece. He's standing in the line of battle with his soldiers, doing what an officer should, leading by example. On the night and morning of the 3rd, when the army decamps Trenton and heads off to Princeton, Peale is doing a night march. That was incredibly unpleasant and difficult for 18th century armies. They can't see anything, so all they've got are starlight or moonlight to help guide them by. Mm-hmm. And so, from personal experience, having gotten lost at night in the 1980s as a young lieutenant, mm-hmm. I can only imagine what it was like marching in 1777 at night on muddy roads, hoping that he did not get lost or separated from his command. So he takes part in something that the militia is not necessarily comfortable with. It's not going to fight a defensive battle. This time, Washington is telling them, "My boys, we're going on the attack." And so so this says something about the faith of the soldiers in their officers, their trust in them, but also the trust in Washington, that they're willing to go on the attack. The militia, and this is not saying that they're cowards, it's just that they're not professional soldiers. They're not all that well trained. And it takes quite a bit for soldiers to go into the attack, particularly against British regulars. These guys are pretty darn good at what they do. Right. So to do this, I think this speaks volumes for the morale and the confidence of those soldiers in the attack. So Peale witnesses all of this. He witnesses the death, the destruction of battle, the dismemberment of bodies, other horrors, and he records it. And that's a really valuable source for all historians as we go through, but also for readers who are simply interested in what Peale saw.
Absolutely.
I think he's able to not so much channel it, well, perhaps channel some of it, but draw what might be perhaps termed best as the most ennobling characteristics, and that's probably not the best word to choose, the imagined heroics of the battlefield, in order to channel that into the creation of this mythologized Washington. Exactly. And so he's, in a sense, keeping
getting paid too, right? So he has
exactly. So he puts the horrors of war in one paint box and puts the idealized vision in another paint box and draws really from the idealized vision.
Do you think in that regard, did he capture the sort of the gumption, the gall, the guts that Washington had at that moment to just turn and counterpunch the British after basically being on the run from them? I mean, what do you think about the character and in that moment, that Washington turned back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're right. Washington had commanded, and I've jokingly said this in front of many a class, the finest track team in North America. When the Continental Army ran, nobody could catch it. So Washington turns around and, as you said, counter punches. He doesn't capture so much the man of action, the guy coming out swinging with left and right, but he does capture Washington's confidence. And you can see, particularly in the last portrait that was shown, there's almost a cockiness to him. Yeah. Washington is confident, and he knows that I've got you punked. I'm here. Yeah. I'm fighting. I'm confident. I'm confident in my soldiers. So he captures some of that internal spirit, some of the pugnacity, not so much the brawler, but the swordsman, the officer, the gentleman, the real fighter. Yeah.
Let's turn to thank you, Rick. Let's turn to some questions. We have a lot. So let me ask, did you draw on Garry Wills' Cincinnatus in your research on how Washington became a symbol of early Republican virtue? Are you aware of that?
Yep. While I did not draw directly on Garry Wills' Cincinnatus, I did in my first book. That, of course, coursed through my mind in this, in terms of how this all plays toward the creation of the myth of Washington as Cincinnatus. That, of course, goes beyond the scope of the paper. I really wanted to limit it down. And as it was, I was editing as I was reading through this. But yeah,
sometimes the way we do our best work.
That's right, by the seat of our pants. And so yes, Garry Wills is certainly present in the back of my mind, although not playing a role directly in this work.
Okay. Mm-hmm. How much time do you think George Washington gave Peale for each portrait? And did Washington respond differently to Peale than he did to, say, Gilbert Stuart because of Peale's military service?
Peale was known for being able to dash off a portrait in pretty fast order, so probably no more than a couple, 3 days. And then he would go out and take, if it was, as he did for Princeton and Trenton, Peale would head out and take sketches. You can see in his collected letters, which are published, you can see his sketches of field guns and other elements to help him understand how to place things, what they should look like. So he works very quickly, and you can see it in some of his works. His works range in terms of technical quality from quite good to rather simple and almost wooden portrayals, but that's beside the point. Says the man who can only do stick figures. We all
have an appreciation.
Indeed. But so Peale works in fairly quick order, getting these portraits off. As far as Washington's comfort, Washington leaves nothing that says that Peale's, having been a soldier who had fought alongside him, doesn't give any indication, but he does in his letters suggest a growing comfort in working with Peale, even a personal fondness, as much fondness as Washington was wont to demonstrate, which was not much. This is all part of Washington's creation of his image. He makes himself a marble man very early on, and so he does develop a comfort with Peale. He does develop over the years almost a resignation to being painted. He doesn't enjoy it any more than he did the first time, but it's become sort of a duty. It's almost as if Washington's thinking, here we go again, I suppose I must. And so he does it. Yeah, but Peale, as I said, because he had sat for Peale so many times, there was in all likelihood a much greater degree of comfort than he would have had with other portraitists.
Okay, I think we have time for just a few more questions.
Sure.
It's hard to select. Let's see. Who are the figures behind Washington in the Princeton portrait? Were you able to kind of?
Oh yeah. If the figures behind him, you've got lying on behind him in the Princeton portrait was his friend. And why am I drawing a blank? What's that?
Hugh Mercer.
Yes, it was Hugh Mercer. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd only spoken his name recently.
You just did. I mean, it was.
I know.
He was the guy that got bayoneted 7 times.
Bayoneted 7 times. Some of the most serious ones were to his abdomen. He'd taken a couple of bayonet thrusts also to his head. And that's all been cleaned up, but you do see a musket with fixed bayonet lying on the ground in front of Mercer, and that's suggestive of that. Holding up Mercer's head is a representation of Benjamin Rush. Rush did treat Mercer, but it was a few days after the battle. Shortly after Rush had heard of Mercer's wounding, he rode as fast as he could to get there, and he was treating him. And Rush reported that he did have some hope, but he was deeply concerned about the wound to his stomach. That, of course, is probably what did him in. Behind them is an unidentified orderly. But going back to Mercer, that was actually Mercer's son who stood in for Mercer. And so you've got the son posing for the father. And this is someone that Peale had also tried to help in the development of his own artistic career.
Right. It's interesting that that Peale portrayed Mercer because just kind of related back to his own witness of war and the brutality, the violence. Like you said, it's cleaned up, but if you know the story of how he died, that's a pretty gory way to go.
So it's ugly. It's you're getting, I forget the length of a British bayonet, but it's something like 8 inches of triangular steel.
Right.
And it enters a soft, fleshy part of your abdomen. It enters your guts. Yeah. It's meant to do damage. But then if you think about what it's carrying in, it's not just the steel. The steel may or may not have been cleaned lately. There may be a thin coat of oil, who knows? Right. It's going in, driving in bits and pieces of your uniform, which may or may not be all that clean. Right. It's carrying in bits of cloth and linen, as well as whatever dirt your body and your uniform have. It's creating sepsis.
Exactly, and I think that's how he died, of infection.
It's an altogether ugly and unpleasant way.
And I just find it fascinating that Peale included that part of, Hugh Mercer's one of the highest ranking officers that died.
Absolutely. On the field of battle.
On the field of battle. So it is, as you point out, a martyr scene, someone who died for his, soon to be country, yes, for his cause. And I think it's very effective that Peale was able to bring that story out and wrap it in. But the fact that he's making a portrait to, heroicize and glorify Washington, and yet including that little chapter of violence, strikes me as maybe that shows that he was a veteran of war.
Maybe, although I think interestingly, when you look at the pose of Mercer and the way he's supported by Rush, it gives you it seems that he's drawing from Renaissance images of the Pietà, and so
Sure. Lamentations.
here's the dying Jesus being held by the Virgin Mary.
Exactly.
So you do have that religious element that.
Hugh Mercer, the dying Jesus. Well, on that note, it's 6 o'clock. Dr. Herrera, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming, for presenting your scholarship. We do hope that you let us know when it is published. And thank you for coming to the dark side of art history, leaving military history and coming over to, I should say, the right side, the light side.
This was so much fun. I took a number of art history classes as an undergraduate. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've appreciated it to some degree, but being able to do this has really opened up for me a whole new venue and a whole new way to practice my craft as a historian. And so I can't thank you enough, and all of you, all of the audience for being here, but I have had so much fun doing this, and who knows, I may dip another toe into the waters of art history.
I hope you do. And I think I'm supposed to plug our next, if I can just 1 second, I need to plug our next talk before I forget. Before ending, I would like to invite you to join us again on Tuesday, September 21st at 5 p.m. on Zoom for the next Greenberg-Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture, entitled Portraits of Promised Lands, in conversation with Hung Liu and Philip Tenari. We hope that you can join us. So thanks again, Rick. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great evening.